Hello, my name is Gary Hall. I teach English at Victoria College, and I'd like to talk today about my book, Murder and Malice, Crimes of Passion from Victoria County, Texas, 1891 to 1913. This book was published in 2006 by Victoria Preservation, Inc. I've done a few presentations on this book over the years, and one question I sometimes get, why would you want to write such a book? As if perhaps I'd done something wrong. As human beings, we have a curiosity about what motivates people, what causes people to do what they do. And there's a lot of true crime shows on television, whether it be 48 Hours Mystery or Dateline Mystery or a whole channel, ID channel, devoted to crime. And I think people find true crime a sort of fascinating story to read. But also the reason I covered the time period I did in this book, 1891 to 1913, is that I wanted to capture a time in Victoria that people weren't familiar with. Not just to convey the crimes that happened perhaps in that time period, but what it was like to live in Victoria during that time period. You have to realize that the turn of the century, last century, 1900s, early 1900s, the population of Victoria was 5,000 people. It's over 60,000 today. In early 1900s, there really wasn't much town north of Rio Grande Street. The town really was encompassed by Rio Grande to the Guadalupe River. So it was what some people at the time would have considered a big town, but certainly it was not a city by any stretch of the imagination. Just to give you an example, in 1907, there were approximately 20 saloons in downtown Victoria, spread downtown Victoria all the way down Bridge Street to the Guadalupe River. In fact, some people don't realize why Bridge Street is called Bridge Street. That's where the bridge used to be. Instead of at Moody Street, where we're used to crossing the river now, there was no bridge there. There was the Iron Bridge at Victoria County Bridge at the end of Bridge Street. This book has 21 chapters in it, and each chapter is a different crime. So in a way, it's almost like reading a collection of short stories, because each chapter deals with a particular crime, and you could put it down and pick it up 3 weeks later and have a different story. But at the same time, this is true crime. This is not fiction. And you come across many of the same citizens from story to story. Perhaps they were the murderer earlier on, and then later they became a victim. So sometimes there are 2 or 3 chapters about the same person. I began this research, and I used much of the research of Sidney Whisiger, who was a wonderful local historian. The Whisiger collection is the Victoria College Library in the Regional History Room, and he kept amazing notes. He was born in 1906 and died in 1975, and he was sort of an historian's historian. He kept all of his notes on history, these little half sheets in drawers, and kept copious notes all of his life. One story I heard about Sidney Whisiger, when he was in the hospital in 1975 on his deathbed, he was still writing notes of local history, and it made the nurses nervous. They thought maybe he was writing negative things about them or something about his care, but he was just wanting to get down every memory he could think of doing with local history. He had a column in The Advocate in the early, 1950s or so. First it was called Sid's Journal, and then it became Vignettes, but it was a local history column. But he never wrote a book, but he did keep a lot of notes. So I used some of his notes as sometimes pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to lead me on to something else. So you see an example of the kind of copious notes that he would keep. He would, with different crimes, sometimes if he was talking about a crime, he would put street numbers or diagrams of what things happened. But of course, he really wasn't very focused on crime. He was mainly just focused on local history in general. But I didn't really set out to write a book on true crime. What I was wanting to do was write a narrative to get a historic marker for my house. And I knew that a man who had grown up in my house in the late 1800s, Leon Pilla, had been murdered on Santa Rosa Street. So I knew he had been murdered, and so I had gone to Whisiger's file and found a notation of the date. So I knew that the college had criminal records that had been donated by the county to Victoria College. And I asked if I could find that file. I assumed there would be some sort of thin manila folder, and the librarian said, well, come back tomorrow and I'll try to have that file for you. Well, when I came back, she didn't have a thin manila folder. She had a whole box full of criminal records. And it turns out this one box was just one of about 30 or 40 boxes of criminal records going back to the 1800s and spanning through the early 1900s. So I found the file I was looking for. I found the file on Leon Pilla, where he'd been murdered in 1899, he'd been shot through the heart in a Wild West type shootout on Santa Rosa Street, and then his body was brought back and put in the parlor of my house for his funeral. You know, I was doing that for the historic marker, but I got to thinking, if his case is that interesting, how many other cases in this box are interesting? So I started going through it, and of course I was looking for the most sensational stories. I wanted the ones that were most interesting. There were a lot of other boring stories about burglaries and petty theft, but I was looking for the more sensational true crimes of murder, and ones that would show, again, Victoria and its environs during that time period. I was impressed by, again, the fact that in some of these records I was looking at, I felt like I was perhaps the first person to look at them in over maybe 80 or 100 years. Some of them had not been cracked open for a long time. And it was interesting to me to see the different colored folders that they had for the crimes. At first I thought there was some sort of method, like one crime was a certain color and another. Turns out no, they just had 3 or 4 primary colors, and one might be theft and the next one might be murder, and there was no rhyme or reason to the colors of the folders. It was interesting because everything, of course, was up until 1901 or 1902 was handwritten. So imagine a court reporter, if you've seen a court reporter in a modern court, imagine a court reporter taking down by hand the testimony and taking down by hand statements and things from defendants or witnesses. So it must have been very laborious at that time period for the court reporter, but it was interesting to see the handwriting, to see how they did things back then. One case that I cover in the book is called Poison Perhaps, and it deals with a woman named Elizabeth Johnson who was accused of a mass poisoning. Turns out that one reason she may have been accused was she had been interested in voodoo. She'd come from Louisiana and had studied a little voodoo, and some people, I guess, were a little superstitious about her or afraid of her. But she was acquitted of that crime and then left Victoria pretty quickly. So the case of Leon Pilla, this is what I was looking for when I was originally searching through the files, and it shows that he's accused of murdering Pedro Torres in September 1897. The chapter in the book on this murder is entitled Murder by Lamplight. Leon Pilla was accused of shooting Pedro Torres through the neck that evening in 1897. And ironically, Leon Pilla's father was a city alderman and had been one of the city aldermen in charge of installing lights in Victoria. So some of the irony is one witness said she claimed she identified Leon Pilla as the shooter. Without light or illumination, which had just been added to Victoria at that time period, he probably would not have been seen at all. He committed this murder just outside of Feek's Saloon, which is about a block and a half from the Guadalupe River on Bridge Street. Again, there were so many saloons at this time period, and some of them have sort of imaginative names, like the White Horse Saloon. There was the Jecker Saloon. There's an Opera House saloons. Many citizens are still familiar with the Hochschild Opera House, which is on the corner of Forest and Liberty Street, which is now used as a venue for events. But at that time period, the late 1800s, the Opera House Saloon was at the back of the Opera House. But I think probably my favorite name of a saloon was the Last Chance, First Chance Saloon, which is on Depot and Santa Rosa Street, right by where the train depot used to be located. I like the idea it was your last chance to get a drink before you got on the train, or it was your first chance to get a drink when you got off of the train. So, and that building still exists as well. So there was just such a rich history of saloons of that time period, but I sometimes think that's what accounted for many of the crimes that were committed at that time period. Sylvain Pilla was Leon Pilla's father, and Sylvain Pilla and his brother Victor had immigrated from Alsace-Lorraine, France in 1848. And Sylvain Pilla had 2 older sons. Both of them got murdered. Leon Pilla was murdered in 1897, and then Eugene his older brother, had been murdered 2 years earlier. His brother Eugene had been murdered during a poker game, arguing over 2 bits in a poker game, which is 25 cents. So for 25 cents, he got hit in the head with an axe in an alleyway after the poker game was over. Both of the Pilla brothers sort of inspired me in many ways to write this book because they were such volatile characters. One of the chapters in the book is entitled An Eye for an Eye, which deals with the maiming of Sheriff William Roper Callender in 1899. This was an ironic case because Sheriff Callender was stabbed right above the eye with a knife, and it cut the optic nerve, and so his eye had to be removed. What made it ironic is his own deputy is the one who stabbed him. His deputy, Sam Thurman, had gotten into an argument with City Marshal George Heck that morning. And George Heck had gone to William Roper Callender, the sheriff, and said, "Will you please try to calm your deputy down?" And so Sheriff Callender knew that Sam Thurman had gone to the carnival, way out of the city limits. Carnival at that time was located at the corner of Airline in Navarro, where Walgreens is now. But to those people back then in 1899, it was out of the city limits. So William Roper Callender rode out to the carnival to talk to his deputy and try to calm him down. He encountered Sam Thurman. Thurman was pretty into his cups. They got into an argument, and Sam Thurman pulled a knife and stabbed his own sheriff right above the eye. William Roper Callender had the ability, before he passed out, to pull his pistol and pistol whip Sam Thurman unconscious. So there was a big trial about that, and it had to do with maiming. Sam Thurman could have spent some jail time. As it was, he was fined $200. And Sheriff William Roper Callender wore a patch over his eye, rather like Rooster Cogburn in the John Wayne movie, for the rest of his life. When I mentioned City Marshal George Heck, it's interesting to note that the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was no city police department in Victoria. There was a city marshal and deputy marshal, and there was a sheriff's department. So in the 1950s, the city police were established. And so for a while, we had three law enforcement entities in Victoria. We had the sheriff's department, the marshal's department, and the police department. In 1957, the city council decided to abolish the position of city marshal, leaving the two entities of sheriff's department and police department that we have today. Finally, when I got to some cases dealing with a little bit later time period, I could deal with documents that were much easier to read. I think this document shows some interesting things about it. For one thing, there were no paper clips back then. Paperclip wasn't even patented until 1900. It's hard to imagine a world without paper clips. But I would find odd fasteners, or sometimes the papers would simply be stuck together with straight pins. While interesting, it was certainly much easier once I got to the time period of about 1901, because then typewriters came into vogue. And so some of the testimony that you may see that's handwritten would start to be typed. It was a lot easier going there. One chapter in the book that I found especially interesting to research is entitled Elegy for Soiled Doves. And it deals with the brothels in Victoria at the time period and different murders that took place there. Again, maybe it seems a little surprising to think there were 20 saloons in Victoria, early 1900s. Well, there were also quite a few brothels in Victoria too, and they oftentimes were a place of drinking and gambling and arguments and crime. I think it's unfortunate that many times the life of women in brothels has been romanticized, maybe in movies like The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas or Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman. But the fact is, it was a pretty horrible plight for many of these young women who had perhaps run away from abusive homes. They really couldn't find much of a job at that time period, so they had to turn to whatever life they could turn to make a living. One case I came across in my research of this particular chapter was the deathbed statement of Viola Coleman. And I was able to hold the original statement in my hand, written by Justice of the Peace H.A. Karsner. And in her deathbed statement, she says that she was shot by the madam of a brothel, and the madam's name was Vic Wallace. And she says in her deathbed statement, "This was not the first time Vic Wallace shot me. She shot me once before. She shot me because I was staying with her husband." So Vic Wallace had shot her in the stomach, and poor Viola Coleman had a rather lingering long death. Vic Wallace must have had some money, or if not money, she must have had some great influence. She hired a team of lawyers. She was accused of murder, and she hired a team of lawyers that included then sitting Lieutenant Governor was on her defense team. And she had 3 other very high-powered lawyers from Victoria, and she was acquitted. And many people think perhaps it was because she had a lot of secrets. And you have to remember, the juries at this time period were made up of all men. Women didn't get the right to vote until 1920, and they certainly weren't on juries. So it may be a lot of the men sitting on the jury thought their name might be in a brothel ledger somewhere, and they certainly didn't want that to come forth. So Vic Wallace was acquitted of what seemed to be a pretty clear-cut case of murder. Another resource I used doing my research were the court ledgers, the original court ledgers. These would be kept by the court clerk, of course, of what cases were pending, what cases were coming up, what cases had been resolved. Again, this page shows Leon Pilla's name when he was accused of murdering Pedro Torres in 1897. So in many ways, it was like putting together pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. I'd find the court transcript in the box of court records, which sometimes would lead me to the right ledger to look at to get some information that might not be included in those court documents. But then we also have Victoria Advocate on microfilm going all the way back to the late 1800s. So then I'd know what date to go research the Victoria Advocate on a microfilm. And then, of course, Wisger's notes, which I talked about at the beginning. So it's kind of like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes Wisger might just give me someone's date of death, but that would lead me to the advocate, which would in turn lead me to the right court criminal box or the right ledger, and I put all the pieces together to get a clearer picture of the murder or whatever had happened. So I think the book does reveal a fascinating history of Victoria, what it was like to live at that time period in terms of the jobs, the immigrants who made up Victoria. It was such a melting pot. The Pilla family I mentioned, a lot of times they were speaking French at home. The Vasati family, they were speaking Italian. So these were all pretty much first-generation immigrants who'd come from Europe, and they were making a life for themselves and their families here in Victoria. So it became a true family of what could have been strangers, but who maybe bonded together because one thing they had in common was they had all started somewhere else. They'd come to Victoria in this area for a dream, and all of them were trying to make that dream happen. Again, my name is Gary Hall, and this has been a talk about Murder and Malice, Crimes of Passion for Victoria County, Texas, 1891 to 1913. I think if you're interested in true crime or what it was like to live in Victoria long ago, you might find this a fascinating read.